In the village of Umudiakbara, blood was thicker than water until the scent of gold changed everything. Adaugo was the elder sister, but she lived in the shadow of her younger sister Neka's prosperity. When a ruthless moneylender threatens to take Adaugo's land, she makes a choice that will haunt her lineage forever. In the crimson-dusted village of Umudiakbara, where the Irako trees whisper secrets to the wind, there lived two sisters born of the same morning mist. Adaugo was the elder, a woman whose face was a map of unspoken bitterness and hard lines. Neka was the younger, a soul as radiant as the first ray of the sun hitting the village stream. In our land, a family's wealth was measured by the laughter in the courtyard and the height of the yam stacks in the barn. But for Adaugo, the only thing that grew in her compound was the cold, gray shadow of debt. While Neka's barns groaned under the weight of her harvest, Adaugo's barn housed only the spiders and the echoes of her own sighs. Her husband, Obinna, was a man of quiet strength, but even the strongest tree bends when the soil is dry and the termites of poverty begin to feast. Every morning, Adaugo watched her husband walk past their meager hearth with his head hung low, his spirit crushed by the heavy hand of the village moneylender. She felt a sharp, stinging seed of envy take root in her chest, watered daily by the mocking whispers of neighbors who had no trouble bearing fruit in their fields. The village moneylender, a man named Motsi Equim, was not like other men. It was whispered in the market square that he had 4 eyes, 2 to watch the living and 2 to bargain with the restless spirits of the night. He was a man who wore gold like a second skin, yet his heart was as hard as a grinding stone. One fateful afternoon, the heavy thud of his staff sounded at Adaugo's gate. The noise was like a drumbeat of doom, shaking the very thatch of their small hut. Obinna stepped outside, his hands trembling as he faced the giant man adorned in coral beads and silk. Motsi Equim did not offer a greeting of peace. Instead, his voice rolled out like thunder over a parched farm. He demanded his silver and his interest, or he would seize the ancestral land that had belonged to Obinna's fathers for generations. Adaugo stood behind the reed curtain, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She watched the shame color her husband's face, and in that moment, the seed of envy in her heart blossomed into a dark, poisonous flower. She realized that the poverty she lived in was a prison, and the keys were held by those with gold. Neka, the younger sister, walked with the grace of a gazelle and the heart of a dove. She knew of her sister's struggles, for in a small village, even the walls have ears, and the wind carries the scent of sorrow. One evening, as the crickets began their nightly song, Neka visited Adaugo's humble compound. She carried a heavy basket on her head, filled with dried fish, jars of red palm oil, and tubers of yam that were as thick as a man's thigh. "My elder sister," Neka said, her voice like the soft tinkling of a bell, "do not let your heart be troubled. The Great Spirit has blessed my harvest this season. I have come to share my bounty, so that your hearth fire does not grow cold." She reached out to touch Adaugo's hand, her eyes shining with genuine sisterly love. But to Adaugo, the touch felt like a brand of hot iron. Every gift Neka offered felt like a heavy stone added to the weight of Adaugo's shame. She looked at the yams and saw not food, but a reminder that she was a beggar in her own family. The younger had become the provider, and the elder had become the servant. Adaugo smiled with her lips, but her soul remained as dark as a moonless night. As the night deepened and the village fell into a watchful silence, Adaugo sat alone by the dying embers of her fire. The laughter from Neka's wealthy compound floated across the path, stinging Adaugo's ears. Neka's husband was a man of great influence, and their children played with silver bells tied to their ankles. Adaugo looked at her own empty money bag, which lay on the dirt floor like a dead snake. A dangerous thought began to crawl through her mind, a thought born of pure desperation and the biting cold of envy. She wondered why the gods had chosen to smile so brightly on the younger sister, while leaving the elder to scavenge in the dust. "Is it fair?" she whispered to the shadows. "Is it right that one womb should produce a queen and a slave?" The shadows did not answer, but the wind rattled the dry palm fronds in a way that sounded like a dark invitation. Adaugo realized that as long as Neka was prosperous, Adaugo would always be the poor relation, the one spoken of with pity in the marketplace. She decided that she would no longer wait for the gods to change her fate. She would take her destiny into her own hands, even if it meant stepping into the darkness. The next evening, when the sun had hidden its face behind the horizon, Adaugo wrapped herself in a dark cloth and slipped out of her compound. She did not take the main path, where the village lanterns glowed. Instead, she took the narrow, winding track that led to the opulent mansion of Matsi Equim. The air grew thick and cold as she approached the gates, which were guarded by men with faces like carved masks. She was led into a parlor that smelled of expensive incense and old secrets. Matsi Equim sat on a throne of polished Irako wood, nursing a cup of imported gin. He looked at Adaugo with his predatory eyes, a slow smile spreading across his oily face. "The debtor returns," he rumbled, his voice vibrating in the small room. "Have you brought my silver, or have you come to offer me your husband's soul to pay the price of your survival?" Adaugo stood tall, though her knees threatened to buckle. "I have not come to beg, Matsi," she said, her voice surprisingly sharp. "I have come to offer you a treasure far greater than the meager silver my husband owes. I have come to speak of my sister, Neka, and the secret source of her golden harvest." Matsi Equim leaned forward, his interest piqued like a hunter hearing the rustle of a deer in the bush. He knew Neka's compound was the wealthiest in the region, and many had wondered how a young couple could amass such fortunes so quickly. "Speak quickly, woman," the moneylender commanded, his eyes narrowing. Adaugo took a deep breath, letting the life form on her tongue like a sweet, deadly fruit. "My sister's prosperity is not from hard work or the grace of the clouds," she hissed. "She has discovered a pot of fortune, buried deep beneath her kitchen hearth. It is an ancient treasure of the village ancestors, filled with gold and jewels that could buy 10 kingdoms. She keeps it hidden from the elders, using only a little at a time to keep her house fat while the rest of us starve." The lie was a terrible thing, a jagged stone thrown into a calm pool. Adaugo knew there was no pot, only Neka's sweat and the blessings of a good heart. She also knew that a man like Matsi Equim would believe any story that promised him more wealth. She watched as greed transformed his face into something truly monstrous and terrifying to behold. Matsi Equim struck his heavy staff against the floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "A pot of fortune?" he whispered, his voice trembling with a dark hunger. "If this is true, that treasure belongs to those with the power to hold it. It is a crime against the ancestors to hide such a thing." He looked at Adaugo, his gaze piercing her very soul. "And what do you want in exchange for this information, daughter of a thief?" Adaugo felt the bile rise in her throat, but she did not flinch. "I want my husband's debt wiped clean," she demanded. "I want the deeds to our ancestral land returned to my hand tonight. And when you take the pot, I want half of the gold for myself. I am the elder. I deserve to walk with my head high in this village." Matsi Equim laughed, a sound like dry bones rattling in a tin bucket. "You are a bold woman, Adaugo. You would sell your own blood for a bag of yellow metal. Very well. The covenant is made. Lead my men to this treasure when the moon reaches its peak on the night of the harvest festival, and you shall be free of your burdens forever." The days leading up to the great harvest festival were a blur of nervous energy and hidden whispers. Adaugo moved through the village like a ghost, her heart a heavy stone in her chest. She avoided her husband's eyes, fearing he would see the treachery written in her gaze. Meanwhile, Neka was busy preparing for the celebration. She invited the entire village to her compound, promising a feast that would be remembered for generations. She even brought Adaugo a beautiful new wrapper, woven with threads of silver and blue. "Wear this, my sister," Neka said with a bright smile. "Let us dance together and show the village that the daughters of our father are still strong." Adaugo took the cloth, her fingers trembling against the fine fabric. She felt a momentary pang of guilt, a small voice in the back of her mind telling her to stop. But then she looked at her own crumbling walls and the empty soup pot on her stove, and the guilt was crushed by the weight of her envy. She realized that she could not go back. The river of her life had already crossed the waterfall, and there was no way to swim against the current of her own dark choices. On the night of the festival, the village of Umudiakbara was alive with the sound of drums and the flickering light of 1,000 torches. The air was thick with the scent of roasting goat and spicy peppers. Neka's compound was the center of the joy. Men and women danced until the dust rose in great clouds, and children chased each other through the legs of the elders. Adaugo arrived late, carrying a small, decorative gourd filled with palm wine. Hidden inside the wine was a potent herb she had obtained from a traveler, a herb that brought a sleep so deep it was often mistaken for the transition to the spirit world. She found Neka sitting on a carved stool, her face glowing with happiness as she watched her family celebrate. "Drink, my beautiful sister," Adaugo said, her voice steady and smooth. "You have worked so hard to provide this joy for us. Take this wine as a token of my love and respect." Neka, trusting and kind, took the gourd without hesitation. She drank deeply, praising the sweetness of the wine and the love of her elder sister. Within moments, her eyelids grew heavy, and she leaned back against the wall of her hut, her breathing slowing into a deep, unnatural slumber. As the village drums reached a crescendo and the dancers moved to the central square, the shadows around Neka's compound began to shift. Adaugo stood by the entrance, her heart racing as she signaled to the darkness. Out of the trees stepped Matsi, Iquim's men, their faces covered in soot and their hands holding heavy digging tools. They moved with the silent efficiency of predators. Adaugo pointed toward the kitchen hut, her fingers shaking. "The hearth," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the distant music. "It is buried deep beneath the stones where she cooks her soup." The men did not hesitate. They burst into the hut and began to tear up the earth. They smashed the clay pots and threw the cooking stones aside with violent force. Adaugo stood outside, her ears ringing with the sound of destruction. She looked at her sleeping sister, lying peacefully just a few feet away, and for a second, she wanted to scream for them to stop. But then she remembered the gold. She remembered the look of pity on the faces of the village women when they saw her old, torn wrappers. She steeled her heart and watched as the men dug deeper into the red earth of Neka's life. The digging continued for hours, but as the hole grew larger, the men's faces grew darker with frustration. They found nothing but red clay, smooth stones, and the roots of an old tree. There was no pot of gold. There were no jewels. Matsi Iquim himself arrived, his golden jewelry clinking as he stepped into the ruined hut. He looked at the massive hole and then at Adaugo, his eyes burning with a terrifying, cold fury. "Where is the treasure, woman?" he roared, his voice shaking the very foundations of the building. Adaugo stepped back, her face turning the color of ash. "It must be there," she stammered, her mind racing. "Perhaps she moved it. Perhaps it is buried under the bed." The men turned their fury on the rest of the compound. They tore through the sleeping quarters, ripping open mattresses and smashing storage chests. In their rage and greed, they set fire to the great yam barns, the source of Neka's true wealth. The dry wood caught instantly, and soon the night sky was filled with the orange glow of 100 burning dreams. Adaugo watched in horror as her sister's life was reduced to smoke and embers, realizing too late that her lie had created a monster she could not control. By the time the sun began to peek over the horizon, the village of Umudiakbara was a scene of devastation. The laughter of the festival had been replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. Neka woke up on the dirt floor, her head spinning from the effects of the drugged wine. She crawled out of her hut only to see the ruins of her life. Her husband had been dragged away in chains, accused by Matsi Iquim of stealing ancestral gold. Her barns were smoldering piles of black charcoal. Her children were huddled in the corner of the compound, crying in terror. "What has happened?" Neka wailed, her voice a ragged scream that tore through the morning air. "Who has done this to me? I have harmed no soul. I have only shared what the earth gave me." Adaugo stood at the edge of the ruins, wearing the expensive new wrapper Neka had given her. She tried to step forward to comfort her sister, but her feet felt like they were rooted in the blood-stained earth. She saw the villagers gathering, their faces full of suspicion and fear. They looked at the ruins, and then they looked at Adaugo, who was the only one standing clean and untouched amidst the destruction of her own family. The village elders summoned a meeting at the village square, under the great ancestral tree. The village elders summoned a meeting at the village square, under the great ancestral tree. The air was tense, and the smell of smoke still hung in the clothes of the people. Matsi Equim stood before the council, his face a mask of righteous anger. I acted to protect the village, he claimed, his voice booming. I was told that this family was hiding ancient treasure that belongs to all of us. When they refused to produce it, my men searched the grounds. The head elder, a man with hair as white as wool and eyes that had seen 100 seasons, turned his gaze toward Adaugo. And who gave you this information, Matsi? The old man asked quietly. Adaugo felt every eye in the village turn toward her. She looked at Neka, who was sitting on the ground, her face covered in soot and tears. Adaugo's heart hammered against her ribs. She had her debt wiped clean, and she had the deed to her land in her pocket, but she felt like the poorest woman in the world. She opened her mouth to speak, but the lie felt like dry sand in her throat. She looked at the crowd and saw the faces of people she had known since childhood, people who now looked at her as if she were a poisonous snake. It was I, Adaugo finally whispered, her voice cracking. I told him of the pot. I thought it was the truth. A collective gasp rose from the villagers. Neka looked up, her eyes wide with a shock so profound it seemed to stop time. You, my sister? Neka breathed, her voice a tiny, broken thing. You, whom I fed when you were hungry. You, for whom I bought this very cloth you are wearing. You sold my life for a pot that never existed. The betrayal was a physical blow, more painful than the fire or the loss of the yams. The villagers began to murmur, their voices rising like a swarm of angry bees. They spoke of the sacred bond of blood and the curse that follows those who break it for the sake of gold. The head elder raised a staff for silence. To betray a stranger is a crime, he declared, his voice heavy with judgment. To betray a sister is an abomination. Adaugo, you have called the fire to your own blood. You have traded a soul for a handful of empty promises. Now, the gods of the land shall decide your harvest. The elders called for the chief priest of the royal python, a man who lived in the deep forest and only emerged when the balance of nature had been shattered. He arrived as the sun reached its highest point, draped in the skin of a leopard and carrying a staff topped with red feathers. He did not look at the elders or the moneylender. He walked straight to the center of the square and began to draw a circle in the red dust with white chalk. He cast cowrie shells and bones into the circle, his lips moving in a silent prayer to the ancestors. Suddenly, the bushes at the edge of the square began to rustle violently. Out of the greenery slithered a massive royal python, its scales shimmering with 1,000 colors. The villagers fell back in terror, but the priest stood still. The serpent did not go toward the ruined barns or the moneylender. It moved with a terrifying, fluid grace directly toward Adaugo. It circled her 3 times, its tongue flickering in the air as if tasting her very thoughts. Adaugo stood frozen, her breath coming in short, jagged gasps. She realized that the gold she had craved could not save her from the judgment of the land. The chief priest looked at the serpent and then at Adaugo. The python is the guardian of the home, he proclaimed, his voice echoing through the silent square. It sees what is hidden in the dark. It knows that you called the thieves to your sister's hearth. It knows that there was no pot of gold, only a pot of envy boiling in your chest. He turned to the villagers. Adaugo has broken the covenant of the womb. She has sought to climb high by treading on the neck of her own kin. Because she values gold above blood, the gold she has gained shall become her heavy chain. He commanded the moneylender to return the deed of the land to the council. Matsi Equim, fearing the wrath of the python and the priest, threw the parchment into the dust. The debt is not paid, the priest said to Adaugo. It is only shifted. From this day forward, you are no longer a daughter of Umudiakpra. You are a wanderer, a woman without a shadow, until you can replace every yam that was burned and every tear that was shed by your sister. The decree was final. Adaugo was stripped of her beautiful wrapper and left with only a tattered cloth to cover her shame. The banishment of Adaugo was a somber event. She was escorted to the edge of the village by the young men, who carried torches to light her way into the dark forest. She was forbidden from speaking to her husband or her sister. As she walked past the ruins of Neka's compound, she saw Neka standing by the smoldering remains of the barn. Neka did not cry out, nor did she throw stones. She simply stood there with a look of ancient sorrow, as if she were looking at a stranger. Adaugo wanted to fall at her feet and beg for a mercy she knew she did not deserve, but the guards pushed her forward. She stepped into the cold, damp embrace of the forest, the sounds of the village fading behind her. For the first time in her life, she was truly alone. She had the silver she had demanded from the lender hidden in her belt, but it felt like a belt of lead, dragging her down into the mud. She realized that she had destroyed 2 lives to save 1 farm, and in the end, she had lost everything: her home, her family, and her name. Years passed, and the story of the 2 sisters became a legend whispered to children on nights when the moon was hidden. Neka, through the strength of her spirit and the help of the villagers who pitied her, began to rebuild. She worked the earth with a fierce determination, and the soil, recognizing her goodness, gave back tenfold. Her husband was released when the truth of the moneylender's greed was fully revealed to the regional elders. They built a new home, even larger than the first, and her children grew into strong men and beautiful women. But Neka was never quite the same. The laughter that had once been like a bell was now a rare and quiet thing. She often sat by her new hearth, looking into the flames with a distant gaze, as if she were still looking for the sister she had lost to the shadows. She never spoke Adaugo's name, but every time she harvested a yam or bought a new cloth, a shadow of sadness would pass over her face. She learned that while the earth can heal, the heart often carries the scars of a betrayal that went deeper than any knife could reach. Deep in the forbidden forest, a ragged woman lived in a hut made of mud and palm fronds. Her hair was a tangled mess of gray and white, and her skin was etched with the lines of 1,000 regrets. She survived on wild berries and the charity of travelers who did not know her face. This was Adaugo, the woman who had sold her soul for a handful of coins. She spent her days sitting by a small, lonely fire, staring at the single silver coin she had kept from her bargain with Matsi Equim. The coin had lost its shine, becoming dull and gray, much like her life. She often heard the distant sound of drums from the village, reminding her of the life she had thrown away. She realized that the envy that had once consumed her was now replaced by a crushing weight of solitude. She understood now that wealth is not found in the things you own, but in the people who love you. She had tried to steal her sister's fortune, but she had only succeeded in stealing her own future. She was a ghost in a world of the living, waiting for a forgiveness that the wind never brought. One evening, a young girl from the village lost her way while gathering herbs and stumbled upon Adaugo's hut. The girl was terrified, for she had heard stories of the hearth thief who lived in the woods. But when she saw the old, broken woman crying by the fire, her fear turned to pity. Adaugo looked at the girl and saw a flash of Neka in her eyes. "Do not be afraid, little one," Adaugo whispered, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "I am only a woman who learned the price of greed too late." She gave the girl a drink of water and showed her the path back to the village. Before the girl left, Adaugo handed her the dull silver coin. "Take this to the house of Neka," she said, her voice trembling. "Tell her it is the first grain of a debt that can never be fully repaid. Tell her the elder sister is still counting the yams in the dark." The girl took the coin and ran, her heart racing. When she reached the village and gave the coin to Neka, the older woman held it for a long time, her tears falling onto the cold metal. The message from the forest stirred something in Neka's heart that had been frozen for a decade. She realized that her sister was not just a villain in a story, but a broken human being living in the shadow of her own sin. Neka gathered a basket of the finest yams from her harvest and a new wrapper of silver and blue. Despite the warnings of her husband and the elders, she walked into the forest. She followed the girl's directions until she reached the small, lonely hut. She found Adaugo sitting on the ground, drawing circles in the dust with a stick. When Adaugo looked up and saw her sister, she did not speak. She simply covered her face with her hands and wept. Neka sat down beside her, the silence between them filled with the weight of 10 years of sorrow. "The python has had its judgment, my sister," Neka said softly. "The land has taken its toll, but the womb that bore us does not know the color of gold. It only knows the heat of the same blood." She placed the new wrapper over Adaugo's shoulders, the silver threads gleaming even in the dim light of the forest. Adaugo looked at the beautiful cloth, the same colors she had worn on the night of her great betrayal. "I destroyed everything, Neka," she sobbed, her voice breaking. "I sold your peace for a lie. I watched your life burn, and I did nothing because I wanted to be the queen of the dust." Neka touched her sister's weathered hand. "Envy is a disease of the eyes, Adaugo. It makes us see thorns as gold and gold as thorns. You let the moneylender's greed become your own, and it ate you from the inside out." They sat together as the sun began to set, the shadows of the trees stretching over them like long, protective arms. Adaugo realized that the forgiveness Neka offered was a treasure far greater than any pot of gold she could have ever imagined. It was a mercy that the world rarely gives, a chance to be human again after being a monster for so long. She knew she could never return to the village as the woman she once was, but she felt a small flicker of light in her chest, the first warmth she had felt since the night of the fire. The two sisters spent the night talking, clearing the weeds of bitterness that had grown over their hearts. Adaugo told Neka of the cold nights in the forest, and the way the silver coin had felt like a hot coal in her hand. Neka told Adaugo of the struggle to rebuild, and the way her children asked about the lost aunt they had never known. By the time the first birds began to sing, the air felt lighter, as if a great storm had finally passed. Neka stood up to leave, her basket empty, but her heart full. "I cannot bring you back to the square, Adaugo," Neka said. "The elders' law is the law of the land. But I will come to the edge of the forest every new moon. I will bring you the fruits of our father's name, and we shall sit together until the stars come out." Adaugo nodded, her eyes bright with a new kind of peace. She understood that her life would always be a quiet one, lived on the margins of the world she had betrayed. But she was no longer a woman without a shadow. She was a sister again. As the months turned into years, the path between the village and the forest became well-worn. Neka kept her promise, and the two sisters became a secret part of the village's life. The story of the betrayal remained a warning, but it was now joined by a story of mercy. The villagers noticed that Neka's compound became even more prosperous, and her laughter returned, softer and wiser than before. They also noticed that the hearth thief of the forest had become a forest mother, a woman who helped lost children and shared her knowledge of herbs with those in need. Adaugo never touched silver again. She found her wealth in the red clay of the forest and the blue of the sky. She learned that the greatest harvest a person can reap is the peace of a quiet conscience. She remained a wanderer in the eyes of the law, but in the eyes of her sister, she was finally home. The envy that had once been a poisonous flower had withered away, replaced by the sturdy, humble roots of a life lived in truth. The legend of the two sisters eventually reached the ears of a new generation. They learned that money is a fickle master, a thing that can build a house but never a home. They learned that the bond of blood is a sacred covenant, a river that should never be poisoned by the salt of envy. In the village of Umudiakpura, people began to look at their neighbors with more kindness and their own blessings with more gratitude. Matsi Ikwim's power eventually faded, for a man who lives by the debt of others eventually finds himself a debtor to the grave. But the story of Adaugo and Neka lived on, a timeless tale of a woman who lost everything to find her soul. Whenever the wind rustles the irako trees and the moon hides behind a cloud, the elders tell of the night the fire burned the barns and the night the silver wrapper brought a sister back. For in the end, The only treasure that truly lasts is the love we give and the mercy we receive. The yams will rot and the gold will dull, but the story of a heart's redemption is a song that the spirits never stop singing. For more stories like this, please subscribe to my YouTube channel.